What's going on, guys? Welcome back to this video. Today's video will be on TryHackMe, and we will carry on with red teaming. So we have completed now around 50% of this pathway, and as you can see today we will be starting the weaponization room. So after we have comprehended the concepts, foundations and basics of reconnaissance, and we have understood how to use some of the reconnaissance tools, now it's time to move on to the next stage in the kill chain, which is the weaponization. Now in the weaponization phase, what happens, the attacker, or it might be you if you are doing a pen test, you're going to create the payload that will be delivered to the target. So in the weaponization here, the authors of this room have laid down a couple methods to create a payload using different file formats. Now there is another method, by the way, in which you could carry on the weaponization phase. So if there are two scenarios. The first one, if you are exploiting a web application or any other service or any other applications running on a different protocol. So if you are exploiting a vulnerability, what happens is that you will need some sort of reverse shell. So through the use of reverse shells, we will be able to make the target respond or make callbacks to our C2 server, right? So the C2 server is where we host our listener, right? So we create a listener. It could be using Netcat, it could be using anything, it could be Python. We can create a listener, and then if we are exploiting a web application or any sort of other application running on different protocol, we will only need some sort of reverse shell. It could be PHP one-liner, it could be Python reverse shell, it could be Java reverse shell. We can just create a reverse shell and deliver it to the vulnerable target. Now, what happens if we are not exploiting an application, rather we want to use social engineering? What happens here, we have to create a payload, okay, and deliver it to the target using social engineering. Now this could be through instant messaging, or it could be through emails. Most of the time it happens through phishing emails. So in this video we're going to go through some of the methods that we can follow to create payloads. Now, so basically the weaponization phase here, in the weaponization phase, it can be categorized, or you can conduct the weaponization phase by So to sum this up, in the weaponization phase, we might be exploiting a web application, alright, and then after the exploitation we will need to deliver a reverse shell, or we might be using social engineering to target the user base. So in both cases you will either need a reverse shell, or you will need a payload, a weaponized payload. In both cases, we are talking about weaponization. Now, in rare scenarios, we might jump to creating backdoors. So basically, when we create a backdoor, we are actually in the phase of weaponization. And creating backdoors may also come later if you want to create persistence. So remember that in the kill chain, what happens, you first conduct a reconnaissance, and then you come to the weaponization phase, where you either use reverse shells after you exploit the web application or the application itself, or you might be using some sort of payload to deliver to the target, or you could create a backdoor and right off the bat deliver the backdoor to your target through a social engineering campaign, such as phishing campaign. You are still here in the weaponization phase. Now there is one scenario where creating backdoor might come as a later stage. So say that you conducted a reconnaissance and then you faced a vulnerable web application, like vulnerable to some CVE, right? You have found an exploit for the web application, and then you used a reverse shell to establish a callback to the listener. Now it happens after you get access here, post-compromise phase, Post compromise is after you get access to the target. Now, to establish persistence, you might resort to creating a backdoor. So creating backdoor can either be post compromise or in the weaponization phase. It depends on the scenario. So let's go back now to weaponization. Weaponization can be actually conducted in 3 different scenarios. The first one, you have a vulnerable application, you found an exploit, and then you weaponized your payload by creating a reverse shell that calls back to your listener. That's the first scenario. The other scenario, you will have to use to create the payload. You might be creating, let's go down, show you guys. You might be creating, guys, a payload using Microsoft Office, macros, or PowerShell, or Visual Basic application, right? So you create a payload. You weaponize the payload and you send the payload as part of a social engineering campaign. This is also weaponization. And the last scenario where you could be conducting weaponization is to create a backdoor, weaponize the backdoor, and then send it to the target. Alright, so now in this video, we're going to take the second scenario. We'll be assuming that you don't have an application or a vulnerable application to exploit. Rather, you want to get access to your target through a social engineering campaign. Specifically, we want to deliver a phishing email to our target. The target will open the email, and hopefully once they open the email and download the attachment, they will open the payload or the weaponized payload that you will create. There are multiple methods to create a weaponized payload. We're not going to talk about the backdoors. Okay, we're going to talk about something else. We're going to talk about a weaponized payload that, if executed, will create a callback to a listener we have on the machine. So we will explore the different methods to create a weaponized payload. Now, weaponized payloads come in different formats. So they can be, let's scroll down. I have multiple things here. I think I have confused you guys. Okay, let's go up. So we can create first a weaponized payload using Visual Basic, or we can create a weaponized payload using an HTA, which is an HTML application. HTML application is an HTML code that contains a snippet of code that will execute a payload. Or we can create a weaponized payload using Microsoft Office macros. PDF documents can be weaponized or can carry a weaponized payload. PowerShell can carry weaponized payloads. Okay, so there are different file formats or different methods you can use to create weaponized payloads. Now, these formats, macros or PowerShell or HTAs or Visual Basic, they might contain a reverse shell. So you can, inside these payloads, you can carry a reverse shell, okay, depending on the scenario. Okay, so we'll explore the different methods using the attacker machine and using the victim machine here. The victim machine is a Windows machine, and the attacker machine here where we create the payloads. So let's clear. Well, let's not clear. Let's use this right away. So the first method is to create. Let's scroll up. All right. So let's see how we can create a Visual Basic reverse shell. Okay. So Visual Basic reverse shells can be created using MSF Venom, or they can be created manually. So here we have a snippet code that calls to the calculator. Okay, what we can do, we can replace this, right, to point to a file we want, a payload we want. Of course, it could be a reverse shell in any file format. Now, Visual Basic reverse shells, as I told you guys, can be created using Metasploit. So if you scroll down here, as you can see with this command, we can create a Visual Basic reverse shell. So why do we create a Visual Basic reverse shell or a Visual Basic payload? So basically here, the reason is we can use it in other file formats like Microsoft Office. So if we go back here to the Windows host, and we're going to assume that we are now creating the weaponized payload. So we're going to open Microsoft Excel. Here we're going to open a blank document, go to View, and then we go to Macros. So here we're going to create a new macro, say it is test, okay, and we will use this workbook, and click on create. Here it opens up the Visual Basic editor. Now, one more time, we can either write this ourselves using Visual Basic, or we can just use MSF Venom to create a small payload. So we're going to go back to the Docker machine, and here scroll down. Okay, as you can see here, we have this command. So this command will create a basic payload in VBA format, as you can see here. Of course, we have put the parameters to point to the attacker machine as far as the IP and the port are concerned. So let's highlight all of this, okay, and paste it in the Visual Basic editor. So since we have the Visual Basic code pre-prepared by MSF Venom, we're going to need to remove these, okay, and paste the code as is. Now, what you have to do is just go to File and Save the book. It's going to ask you where to save this. You're going to go to Desktop and name this as Excel Payload. And don't forget to save it as Excel Macro Enabled Workbook. Save. And now your payload is ready. What you have to do, you have to then send this payload to your victim, right? Through instant messaging or through a phishing email as part of a social engineering campaign. Now, once your target downloads the attachment, they can double click, right? And they will see this statement, security warning, macros have been disabled. So basically what this tells the victim is that the macros of this document contains macros, okay? Now macros on their own, they are not evil, okay? They are used to automate repetitive tasks or manual work. So basically, if the target trusts the sender, they will go ahead and click on enable the content, which means the macro will be executed. Now, of course, nothing happened here because we forgot to enable the listener. So MSF Venom, MSF Console. So here, use exploit handler. All right, the payload. Now let's set a interpreter payload. And set lhost to equal the IP address that we set earlier when we created the payload. So let's copy that all the way down, scroll, and then paste. Set lport. Now the lport has to be equal to the lport we used earlier, which is 4545. So 4545, exploit, and then you run the payload. And now as you can see, we received the interpreter shell. So that's one method we can weaponize a Microsoft Office document using Visual Basic and macros. Now, this is a very common method to send payloads to victims or even to create backdoors. Like the macros here can be created or programmed to not only deliver a payload, but also to create persistence and act as a backdoor on the target machine. If you do that, you are creating not only a weaponized payload, but you are creating a backdoor. So that's one method we can create a weaponized payload. The other method here, let's scroll down. Okay, so Visual Basic with Microsoft and Microsoft macros. So here, an alternative method is to use HTML applications to create the payload in the format of HTA, which means this is an HTML application, right? Like it's gonna be the payload will be created in the form of a URL. So at the end, you're gonna create a URL and send it to the victim. If the victim opens the URL, you're gonna have the reverse shell ready. So this can be accomplished using MSF Venom. So we copy that and we create an HTA weaponized payload. So here, open the terminal, open a new tab. So the IP is 10.115.0, and let's change the port to 4546 this time. Okay, and we're gonna proceed and create the HTA payload. Now remember, if you want to use this in a real engagement, you might need to create some sort of obfuscation on top of the payload. Now, I'm not saying that MSF Venom won't work today. It can work, but in addition to the creating the weaponized payload, you will have maybe to create or obfuscate the payload using packers, right? Packers are very, prominent over the internet. You can just go ahead and find many websites that let you enable or let you download packers. So just you can apply packing and compression on your payload, and you will be able to bypass at least 50% of the endpoints. So now the payload has been saved. What to do now? We need a listener, right? So basically, again, we're gonna launch MSF console. Now you might be asking me how to deliver this to the Windows machine. So this is one method, right? You can deliver this through, again, instant messaging or as part of a phishing email. Now let's say you want a ready URL to deliver to the target using HTML payloads. You can just follow this module. So use exploit, use this module, and then we're gonna have to set the parameters like the IP, the port, the server host, and the payload. Let's set the payload to interpreter. Show options, set L host 10.10.115. It's already set. The port is fine as long as it's different than 4545, because we have a session running on 4545. So we're gonna need to set also the server host. The server host is the IP address on which the payload will be hosted. So it is the IP address, should be the IP address of the machine running a web server. Okay. In the case of this video, it is the same as the attacker machine. So set server host to 10.10.115. It's the same as lhost. Okay. Now once you have the parameters set, you can just exploit, and Metasploit will give you a URL. Now this URL, you're gonna copy the URL and open it on the victim browser. Of course, we assume that you are, we assume that this URL should be shortened using URL shorteners and then sent to the victim. Now, if you are doing this over the public internet, you might have to use your public IP address here. Okay, and make sure that the port on which the listener is running is open in the firewall, and also the port for 4.4s or any other port you want to use to listen for incoming connections. It should be open on your router and the firewall. Let's go back. So now we, oops, what happened? Let's see here. Copy the URL one more time, and then, so now as you can see, the payload is delivered. So you open the payload, keep, run. You see to have this warning. And now we received the session. So that's another method of creating weaponized payloads. Alright, what is another method other than Microsoft Office macros or HTML applications? We can create weaponized payloads as PDF documents or using PowerShell. We're gonna touch on these in the next video. So for now, that's it for today, guys. I hope you like it, and I'm gonna see you in the next video.